She was only 6, but her eyes carried the weight of someone 3 times her age. While other children built castles of sand, she learned to build walls of silence. The playground, for her, was never a field of laughter, but a classroom of survival. Her mother's voice, always trembling on the edge of exhaustion, taught her early that comfort was not guaranteed. Bills whispered louder than bedtime stories. The girl, let's call her Clara, watched her mother's trembling hands count coins on the kitchen table, and in those moments, innocence drained away. Clara discovered quickly that childhood was a fragile privilege, one she was not allowed to keep. She learned to soothe her younger brother when the cries of hunger echoed in the small apartment. She rocked him to sleep with lullabies she barely knew, while her mother worked late nights to keep the electricity from vanishing. At school, Clara's teachers admired her maturity. She listened carefully, always did her homework, and never complained. But what they mistook for discipline was survival. Clara didn't raise her hand to ask questions, not because she understood everything, but because she had learned that her questions rarely mattered in a world already too busy. The other children noticed the difference too. They laughed loudly, argued over toys, and sulked when the day didn't go their way. Clara, instead, observed them with a quiet intensity. She envied their freedom to cry over broken crayons. She envied the innocence that allowed them to be fragile without shame. At home, Clara grew used to conversations that belonged to adults: rent, sickness, debts, absent fathers. She could recite the language of worry before she could spell her own name correctly. Each word carved a line of responsibility deeper into her small frame. And so her psychology began to shape itself. A child who did not feel safe in the world could not risk vulnerability. Clara became the protector, the fixer, the little adult in a child's body. Her laughter, when it appeared, was fleeting, quickly swallowed by the shadows of obligation. Even her dreams betrayed her. At night, instead of stories about flying or fairylands, she dreamed of locked doors and unfinished meals. She dreamed of storms and of standing alone, holding an umbrella too big for her little hands. From the outside, Clara appeared strong. From the inside, she was already fracturing. Childhood, after all, is not designed to hold the weight of responsibility. But no one noticed. No one asked. And Clara, believing that her only value was in carrying burdens, never complained. The playground faded from her memory. The swing sets, the giggles, the scraped knees, all replaced by the silent hum of adulthood pressing against her small shoulders. She did not yet know it, but these early years would echo for the rest of her life, shaping every decision, every relationship, every thought about who she was allowed to be. Because when a child grows up too fast, they never really grow into themselves. They grow around their wounds. By the time Clara turned 9, she had already mastered the art of wearing masks. Children her age learned how to tie their shoes, ride bikes without training wheels, or memorize multiplication tables. Clara, instead, learned how to smile when she didn't feel like smiling. The mirror in her small bedroom became her secret teacher. Standing before it, she practiced expressions: wide eyes to hide fear, a soft smile to reassure her brother, a steady gaze to convince her mother she was strong. Every morning, before stepping into the world, she put on her mask. It was her armor against pity, against the risk of someone seeing just how fragile she was beneath the surface. At school, teachers praised her poise. "Such a responsible young lady," they would say, patting her shoulder. But responsibility is heavy when it isn't chosen. Clara carried it like a stone in her chest. She rarely joined games during recess, preferring instead to sit under the tree near the fence, watching others laugh. The noise of their carefree joy made her feel like an intruder in a world she had lost too early. Her classmates sometimes asked her to play, but Clara had learned that attachment was dangerous. If she allowed herself to laugh too much, to feel too light, the return to her heavy reality would hurt even more. So she politely declined, always with a smile, the mask perfectly in place. At home, her younger brother depended on her more each day. He clung to her hand when thunder rolled outside, trusted her to explain why their father's voice no longer filled the house. Clara invented gentle stories to protect him from the truth, though inside she burned with questions she dared not ask. Why did adults vanish? Why did promises break so easily? Why was she left to hold everything together? Children who grow up too fast often become invisible. Adults, blinded by their maturity, forget they are still children. Clara's mother leaned on her more and more, asking her to help with chores, with caring for her brother, with listening when the weight of life became too heavy. Clara nodded, said yes, never refused. She believed love was earned through sacrifice, and so she gave until she had nothing left for herself. But the silence inside her was growing. Sometimes at night, after her brother had fallen asleep, Clara would stare at the ceiling and feel an ache she couldn't name. It wasn't quite sadness nor anger, but something heavier, a loneliness so complete that it felt like she was disappearing. She wondered if anyone could ever see past the mask, past the smile, and recognize the child hidden inside. The mask, however, was both her prison and her protection. Without it, she feared she would shatter. With it, she feared she would never be found. And so Clara learned one of the most dangerous lessons of all, that to be loved, she must never show weakness. That vulnerability was a threat, not a bridge. The childhood was not her home, but a costume she could no longer fit into. The mirror in her room reflected her face faithfully, but the girl in the glass was already a stranger. A child outside, an old soul inside. Someone who understood too much and yet felt completely misunderstood. The mask became her survival. But every mask leaves a mark. By 12, Clara had learned to read people the way others read books. A furrowed brow, a sigh too heavy, the way someone's hands trembled. These became her vocabulary. Where other children memorized poems, Clara memorized moods, anticipating danger before it arrived. This sensitivity made her seem wise beyond her years, but wisdom born from survival always carries a wound. Clara was no longer just a child living through difficult days. She was a silent observer of pain, decoding emotions in adults who should have been shielding her. At school, her teachers noticed her calmness. When classmates argued, Clara often stepped between them, speaking in a voice steady enough to silence the storm. They admired her composure, unaware that it wasn't peace she carried, but exhaustion. Clara had no room for tantrums of her own. She had long ago forfeited the right to collapse. She excelled in academics, but not out of joy. Studying was her escape, a place where logic and structure replaced chaos. Books were dependable, characters stayed, endings were written, nothing vanished without explanation. Every good grade was not a triumph, but a lifeline. If she succeeded, maybe she could someday escape the endless cycle of survival. But outside those pages, reality pressed in. At home, her mother leaned more heavily on her. Clara cooked meals, folded laundry, and quieted her brother's fears when their mother's absence stretched long into the night. Sometimes she even lied to him, promising that things would get better, though she herself no longer believed it. The price of growing up too fast is not only innocence lost, it is identity blurred. Clara no longer knew where her role as a daughter ended and where her role as caretaker began. She felt invisible, except when she was needed. Love, in her mind, became inseparable from usefulness. If she wasn't helping, fixing, or soothing, then what value did she have? On her 12th birthday, there was no party, no cake, no candles, no balloons. Her mother kissed her forehead, whispered an apology, and hurried off to work. Clara smiled, pretended it didn't matter, but inside she felt the sharp sting of absence. Childhood, she realized, was slipping further away with every year. That night, when the house was quiet, she sat by the window and stared at the stars. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be free, free of responsibility, free of the endless weight of other people's needs. She longed to scream, to cry, to demand that someone take care of her for once. But the scream never came. Instead, she swallowed it, burying the ache deeper. Clara was becoming what psychologists call parentified, a child forced into the role of an adult. She carried herself with grace, but it was a grace built from survival, not from joy. And the more she carried, the less she remembered how to simply be. The lessons written in shadows were etched into her psyche. Trust is fragile. Love must be earned. Weakness is dangerous. Childhood is a debt she would never recover. Each belief took root in her, quietly shaping the person she was becoming. And though Clara didn't know it yet, these silent lessons would follow her long into adulthood, echoing in every friendship, every relationship, every moment where she tried and failed to simply rest. Because when you learn too early to survive, you forget how to live. Adolescence is supposed to be rebellion, experimentation, the fragile dance between childhood and adulthood. For Clara, it was only chains disguised as choices. By 15, she no longer resembled the other girls in her class. While they painted their nails, whispered secrets about first kisses, and argued with parents over curfews, Clara was grocery shopping, paying bills, and trying to stretch money that was never enough. Her body was changing, her emotions intensifying, but she had no room to explore them. Whenever she felt the fire of anger or the ache of longing, she swallowed it whole, like medicine with no water. She had mastered silence, and silence became her identity. At school, Clara walked hallways with quiet dignity. She earned respect for her grades and her maturity, but admiration often isolates more than it connects. Her classmates saw her as reliable but distant. Friendships formed around her but never with her. She was the listener, never the sharer, the comforter, never the one comforted. Loneliness settled inside her like a second skin. When she looked in the mirror now, she no longer saw the mask of a child pretending to be strong. She saw a young woman hardened by necessity. There were moments she wanted to smash that reflection, to find the child she had lost beneath the glass. But she didn't even know if that child existed anymore. At home, her brother leaned on her as if she were a parent. He was old enough to notice the absence of their father, old enough to sense their mother's exhaustion. It was Clara who explained, who softened reality, who carried the questions she herself could not answer. Her mother, worn down by endless work, often leaned on Clara too, praising her for being the strong one. Clara smiled at the words, but inside, she resented them. Being strong was never a choice. It was a sentence. The natural turbulence of adolescence had no place in her life. She had no luxury of slamming doors or demanding freedom. Every outburst would mean instability, and instability was dangerous. So Clara traded rebellion for reliability, traded dreams for duties. But cracks were forming. Some nights, when the house was finally quiet, Clara allowed herself the forbidden, imagining a different life. She dreamed of music festivals, road trips, days spent laughing without worry. Sometimes she even wrote in a hidden notebook words she would never say aloud, feelings she could not share. It was the only space where she was allowed to be raw, fragile, human. The psychology of her adolescence was a paradox. She was praised for being mature, but punished by the very maturity that robbed her of adolescence. She was admired for her strength, yet that strength made her invisible. She lived in a world where being needed was the only proof of being loved. And so she moved through those teenage years like a ghost, tethered to responsibility. Each day pressed her further into adulthood, but adulthood built on broken foundations does not lead to freedom. It leads to collapse. Clara didn't collapse yet, but the weight was growing, and no child, no adolescent, no human can carry a world forever. When Clara turned 18, the world told her she was free. Free to choose, free to explore, free to build her own future. But for Clara, freedom was another kind of prison, one without clear walls, but with invisible chains forged long ago. She left home for university, carrying a single suitcase and 1,000 unspoken fears. On the surface, she was like every other student, nervous, excited, uncertain, but inside, Clara felt decades older than her peers. Their conversations revolved around parties, romances, and the thrill of independence. Hers revolved around survival, scholarships, part-time jobs, unpaid bills. Freedom had a price, and she knew it well. She tried to blend in. She went to classes, studied late into the night, and even accepted invitations to small gatherings. Yet she always felt like an outsider. When her classmates laughed freely, Clara smiled politely but could not join in. The sound of their carefree joy felt like a language she had forgotten. Relationships were difficult. Friends admired her responsibility, her calmness, her reliability. But Clara struggled to let anyone see beyond the mask. She feared that if she exposed her vulnerabilities, the anger, the exhaustion, the hunger for affection, people would leave. Love, in her mind, was conditional, fragile, and something to be earned. So she remained guarded, giving support, but rarely asking for it. Romantic relationships were even harder. When someone showed interest, Clara felt torn between longing and terror. Part of her craved closeness, the kind she had been denied for so long, but another part whispered warnings. Don't need too much. Don't trust too easily. Don't let them see the cracks. And so she kept her distance, sabotaging intimacy before it could demand her raw self. At night, the loneliness was sharp. In the quiet of her dorm room, Clara sometimes pressed her hands against her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. The notebooks she filled with hidden thoughts became heavier, darker. She wrote about the child she had lost, the teenager who never got to rebel, the young woman now trapped in a body that felt too tired for its age. Yet Clara also carried resilience. Years of responsibility had sharpened her discipline, and this strength allowed her to excel academically. Professors noticed her determination, offering opportunities she would have never imagined. She took them all, not out of passion, but out of necessity. Success to her was not a dream, but a lifeline. Still, even as doors opened, Clara felt the hollowness inside. Achievements could not fill the space where her childhood should have been. Every success came with the same question echoing inside her. Who am I, if not the strong one? Who am I, if I stop carrying the world? Freedom, she realized, was not just about leaving home or making choices. True freedom was the ability to be vulnerable, to trust, to rest without guilt. And that, more than anything, remained beyond her reach. Clara was free in name, but bound in spirit, and the invisible chains of her past clinked softly with every step she took into adulthood. Clara entered the workforce with the same discipline that had carried her through school. While others stumbled, experimenting with jobs and discovering themselves, she focused, relentless and steady. Employers admired her punctuality, her precision, her ability to stay calm under pressure. Reliable, they called her. Strong, they repeated. Words that had followed her since childhood, like chains disguised as compliments. She climbed quickly. Promotions came, responsibilities multiplied, and by her mid-20s, Clara was in a position that many envied. But the higher she climbed, the heavier the air became. Beneath her polished exterior, cracks were forming. Work, for Clara, was not passion, it was survival. She didn't feel joy in her achievements. She felt relief, as though she had narrowly escaped some unseen disaster. Every success was proof she was still worthy, still useful. But inside, exhaustion gnawed at her. Nights became sleepless. Weekends disappeared into catch-up tasks. She lived not in the present, but in a constant state of bracing for collapse. Her colleagues noticed her composure, but not her emptiness. She smiled in meetings, nodded during conversations, played the role of the competent professional, Yet when she returned home to her small apartment, silence engulfed her. The mask fell, and she was left with the echo of her own loneliness. Relationships continued to falter. Clara longed for intimacy, but recoiled from it. The moment someone came too close, she felt trapped. She feared their expectations, feared being seen as fragile, feared that if she stopped being the strong one, she would be abandoned. And so she built walls around herself, polished and invisible, impossible to climb. There were moments when the child within her screamed to be heard. Times when she wanted to throw her phone across the room, cancel meetings, disappear into a place where no one expected anything of her. But the scream never came out. Instead, it turned inward, manifesting as migraines, fatigue, and an ache in her chest that doctors could not explain. Clara had become the perfect adult society admired, responsible, successful, composed. Yet she was also the perfect example of a child who had grown up too fast, now trapped in a cycle of silent suffering. The irony was cruel. The very traits that had saved her as a child, self-reliance, composure, maturity, were now the traits that kept her isolated as an adult. She had built her life on strength, but strength without softness becomes a prison. One evening after another long day, Clara stood in her kitchen, staring at a single cup of tea. The silence felt suffocating. For the first time, she whispered aloud to herself, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." The words trembled, as if they belonged to the child she once was. It was the first crack in her carefully constructed life. A small fracture, invisible to the world, but undeniable to her. Healing did not look like Clara expected. It was not a grand transformation, not a sudden burst of joy that erased her pain. It was quieter than that. Healing looked like learning to breathe again, without feeling guilty. It looked like sitting on a park bench and noticing the sound of birds. It looked like saying no and realizing the world did not collapse because of it. In her early 30s, Clara began to notice something new: space. For the first time, there was room inside her life for more than survival. She still worked hard, still carried responsibility, but she no longer carried it alone. Therapy had taught her that asking for help was not a weakness, it was an act of trust. And slowly, she began to practice that trust. Her relationships shifted. With friends, she stopped playing only the role of listener and began, cautiously, to share pieces of herself. At first, her voice trembled, as if confession itself were dangerous. But to her surprise, people leaned closer, not away. They did not abandon her when she revealed her fears. They embraced her more. Romantic love remained a fragile frontier, but even there, Clara felt change. She no longer sought perfection in herself before letting someone near. Instead, she allowed the possibility of being loved in her incompleteness. It terrified her, but it also softened her. For the first time, intimacy felt less like a threat and more like a promise. The child inside her, the one who once stood in the kitchen counting coins, the one who practiced smiles in the mirror, had not disappeared. But Clara no longer silenced her. Sometimes she even gave her a voice. She bought herself coloring books, let herself eat ice cream for dinner, ran barefoot through the grass on summer days. They were small acts, almost silly, but each one was a rebellion against the years she had been denied. She realized healing was not about erasing the past. The wounds would always be part of her story. But healing meant weaving those wounds into her identity in a way that no longer defined her completely. She could be both, the child who grew up too fast and the woman learning finally how to slow down. One evening, Clara returned to the playground near her apartment. Children ran freely, their laughter ringing in the air. She sat on a swing, hesitant at first, then pushed herself gently forward. The chains creaked, the ground shifted, and for a moment she felt the strange, beautiful sensation of weightlessness. She closed her eyes and smiled, not the practiced smile of her childhood, not the polite smile of her adulthood, but a real one, the kind that came not from duty, but from being present. Clara knew life would never be simple. The scars of growing up too fast would always shape her. But scars are not just reminders of pain, they are proof of survival. And survival, when transformed, becomes strength of a different kind. For the first time, Clara was not just surviving, she was beginning to live.